You'll be the one I look to.
Are there? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm thinking I just need to be a little more quiet. Are
Notes?
there sheets?
Yes,
Yeah,
notes.
yeah.
We have notes. Chapter 26, for those who are joining us on the tube, chapter 26 by Ray Pennings. It's in the book called Living for God's Glory, Introduction to Calvinism. Everybody loves that word, Calvinism.
Joel Beeke.
By Joel Beeke. Right. And we are on chapter 26 that's entitled Political Ministers of God. So it's in the context of the unit, I think it's unit 5, isn't it? Or it's, what do they call it exactly? Unit 5. Calvinism in Practice. So it began with a theology for all of life. That was the first chapter. Calvinism in Practice. So Unit 1, we talked about the history. Unit 2, Calvinism in the mind. That was the 5 points of Calvinism. Usually a lot of people think of Calvinism, that's what they think of. And then the 5 solas, I think of Reformed theology, even Lutherans, they'll even try to gravitate towards the idea of the 5 solas. That was part 2. Part 3, Calvinism in the heart. So God exalting piety, practice, thought, cultivating the spirit, focusing on prayer, focusing on godliness. So an ethos of not just theology up here, and not even just theology up here, but it would pour out and it would create an ethos about us, about our lives. Then it moved to part 4, Calvinism in the church. And out of that, Calvinism, and so we talked about Reformed preaching, Reformed worship, reforming the church, i.e. church government that looked looked a lot different than how church was done around that time. And then moved into today's context of part 5, Calvinism in Practice. And so we've been talking about this phrase, Jesus Christ is Lord or King over all life. So talked about different spheres, like the sphere of the family, different families, people and families covenanting together to form churches or a church. And today we're talking about this civil sphere, right? Different churches, families, churches, and then families even outside of churches, right? Forming what's known as this civil sphere. And we've been emphasizing how a lot of churches even, they'll talk about Jesus being Lord over a family and a Lord over the church. But Reformed theology likes to really emphasize this aspect, Jesus being king over the civil authority. This is where all kinds of conversations will happen, even on the news, right? So even recently, well, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't a Christian, but he understood some of this, where he said things like, all right, we have unalienable rights that come from who? That come from God. And so he wasn't a Christian necessarily, right? He was a deist. He was a deist, so he would say God in a general sense, but he understood this. There's some kind of transfer, right? God, if there's a God, in some sense, he's in charge of everything, right? And still today, a lot of people believe this, right? That for Christians, but there's a lot of discussion about this and coming up in the news. Usually the phrase Christian nationalism will be thrown around. And I heard Ben, were you talking to me about Michael Knowles? Mm-hmm. Was that you and me talking? Mm-hmm. He was playing the clip from Heidi Przyzwala. She's a Politico analyst, I think. She was on MSNBC, and she's
a journalist.
She's a journalist. Yeah. She was making a point to say Christian nationalists are very extreme because they believe that rights, individual rights, do not come from governments or people; they come from God. And this is extreme. That rights, this belief that rights come from God, in her view, right? And not, everybody sitting in the listening in and they're like, wow, can you believe that people believe such things? So there it is, right? This is this is an open conversation, and it's being tagged as Christian nationalism, which, sometimes you just say, well, if the shoe fits, wear it. If that's what you mean by Christian nationalism, yes, we do believe that rights come from God, and even more so, that Jesus Christ is Lord actually over every sphere. So he is king. So oftentimes when Americans will say, we have no king, I'll correct them, especially if they're Christians, and say, yes, we do. His name is Jesus, right? And too often I think we forget that, even as Christians, we forget that Jesus is king over our sphere. So that leads us to this discussion then, I think, about political ministers of God. Ben, did you get a chance to read this?
I read excerpts from it, not front to back.
Not cover to cover?
Not cover to cover.
Okay, that's okay. Just getting the feel for who's read it. So
I'm more
proceed.
in Ben's camp. I want to listen.
Yeah.
And understand some stuff.
Yeah. And so at the very front end of the notes, you'll see the questions, and these are just the questions from the back of the chapter. And introduction, we talked some of this last week, I think, but Calvinism, he makes the point, it's often a pejorative term. So even if it's brought up today, it's usually thought, well, the Calvinists back then, they believed that rights came from God, etc. But it did inform views. This is from Pennings, who wrote this chapter, that views about the nature of man and man's sinfulness leads to creation of certain political systems. For example, limitations of power, checks and balances, Bill of Rights, right? So a lot of people who lived during the founding of America, for example, and made different covenants and state constitutions and eventually the federal constitution, they wanted to limit powers of the government. Or when the government had powers, they wanted to spread it out, right? Have checks and balances. Why? Why did they do that? Why did they think that? If you think that man is good naturally, why would you do such a thing?
We didn't think that.
We didn't think that. That's the answer. Right, exactly. Good answer. What did we think? Well, we were reared, by and large, by Reformed theology that taught what? Well, going back all the way to the Calvinism of the mind, that we're totally depraved. Every single person. And even when a person is regenerated by the Holy Spirit, they're still a sinner and they still struggle with sin, right?
Right.
And so the idea then is like, okay, so we believe this, and even if we don't believe it wholeheartedly, we've been reared in it, and this is what our view of the world is, right? Is this world view of the sinfulness of man. Therefore, we're not going to hand ultimate power into the hands of one person or even one group. We're going to spread it out and have a system of checks and balances that one system can check the other, right? And make government, federal government, big government, as slow and as slow as possible, right? Because we don't want anything to go too fast, because we know that in the heart of man, the Bible says, deceitful above all things, we can know it, right? And so Calvinism also is seen as a root, this is Pennings again, in the introduction, is seen as a root of modern systems of government, resistance to unjust authority, provides examples of forms of government to establish self-government. To realize, I think it's really important for us to realize a lot of things in history, it just doesn't pop out of nowhere. Like why do people go from everybody having a king, right, and thinking his power is pretty much absolute, to not thinking that? How do we go from that way of thinking? And Pennings argues, well, it's because of Reformed theology, by and large, and the Protestant Reformation creating questions and ideas and returns to the Bible, separations of spheres of sovereignty, for example, that we've been talking about. Calvinism, he makes this point in the introduction again, Calvinism leads to a particular theology, which then leads to a certain church organization, and then to a social order that gives political organization. That's different. So that's his point, right? He's trying to say, you individually, because of what God is showing us in the Bible, we want to do church a certain way then, right? Because of what we see in the scriptures. And because of theology and church government even, now when we enter into the civil sphere, things begin to change historically. People begin to think differently and say, perhaps we should organize our system of government in the civil sphere in similar ways that we see in the family and also in church. but also how God has structured civil government. So that was a quick introduction. Any thoughts or questions on that real quick? Vince, did you have something or?
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I think one of the things that kind of strikes you today is how much there are those out there that want to continue to change this idea. In other words, that Calvinism leads to a particular theology leading to a certain church organization, and then a social order that gives political organization. That's becoming almost unheard of, or that's offensive to a lot of people.
It's hard to engage with people now that after going through a lot of this stuff, when you talk to them, you're so getting such a good clarity on these things. And I mean, some people have it, some Reformed people have it, these guys that I've been meeting with to do the hiking with. And some of the guys get it, some of the guys don't. And it's very obvious the ones who don't get it.
Yeah.
And don't. And it's again, so it is acquired knowledge. I think a lot of it's very, very, very biblical, especially these Puritan stuff.
Mhm.
And this idea right here, talking a lot about this in our group.
Yeah.
It really draws a clear line between pseudo-Christians or Christians who are maybe on the more worldly side of things,
Mhm.
and those who really believe Christ is Lord.
When you see the logic of how Calvin approached this, it's incredible. I mean, it is so, it should be so clear in exactly what we're talking about right now, that almost without argument, because it works. It absolutely works.
If it's applied.
If
it's applied rightly, right?
Yeah.
So of course there's breakdowns, but the breakdowns, especially for Christians, we need to realize the breakdowns are not because people follow the Bible. It's because by and large, actually, in a lot of ways, is that they didn't follow it enough. Case in point, like when you think about slavery, that's the big one. Oh, Christians, you want slavery reinstituted, right? Oh no, we don't like the Old Testament because we're New Testament Christians. That's one answer, and that's an awful answer.
Yeah.
Right? How I answer it is no, it's because people didn't actually follow the biblical ordinances about slavery. Right? People came over from Africa. Could you imagine? If people came over from Africa and they were loved by their slave owners and they were prepared to go out
That's right.
and sent out on the 7th year, just like the Bible says, and they were equipped and given land. And could you imagine what a difference that would be? Well, they didn't. They said, nope, you're black, therefore you're enslaved forever. And they disobeyed all the injunctions in that. We don't need to be afraid of Exodus 21 through the end of the book, right? Through 40. We can look at that and say, wow, we missed it. We didn't obey God's law. We said we were, but we weren't.
There were
Right.
some southern plantation owners that did follow that. In other words, they were right on. I mean, they supported them as they came over.
Right.
And after a certain period of time, they were set free.
By and large, the majority followed Pharaoh's.
You're right. His paradigm, his pattern, they followed the Pharaoh pattern. That's right. The bad Pharaoh pattern.
Right.
I remember the first time Jack was said, wait, Daddy, there's good pharaohs and there's bad pharaohs. I said, right, good observation. But Pharaoh in Moses' day, right?
Yes.
That's could you imagine if America actually followed the Bible, truly, through and through? And that was just one example of slavery. It would have changed everything.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually it's a self-destructive system. That's what the Bible in the law, right? You have slaves, but eventually they're set free. People are trained up to be set free.
You could make a case that there would not have been a civil war.
Right. And I think that was the punishment on America and even claiming to be Christian, right? At the same time, and claiming to follow the Bible while inverting it, a big chunk of it. And Abraham Lincoln even said, this is our punishment for disobeying him, for disobeying the king. Right? Abraham Lincoln, my goodness, who was an old school Calvinist, just like this church was.
Mm-hmm.
Pennings says, so some of the major themes that he brings up, he says that Reformed Christians has seen there should be an openness to changing views on how government should be worked out over time, since this was not a question of salvation, but lower on the, this is my word, on the theological triage scale. And this was Calvin's experience. Everybody understand what I mean by that? The triage? So,
I can quote what he said too.
yeah, go ahead.
He said specifically, because quoting Calvin, because things of this nature are not necessary to salvation, this is the triage, and for the edification of the church, should be accommodated to the varying circumstances of each age and nation. It will be proper as the interests of the church may require to change and abrogate the old, as well as to introduce new forms.
So the way civil government should be structured, he didn't see in the Bible that this is, if you had a view, this certain view or a different view, that this determined whether or not you were a Christian. So that's what I mean by theological triage. It's not a first tier issue. So if somebody came in here and said, I think, America should have a king like the King of England, we wouldn't say, you can't be a part of our church. Or maybe we would, maybe people want to, I got questions, but that's, I don't think anybody would actually say, well, I don't think that person is a Christian, right? I would think, but you never know. We might think differently about Marxism, right? That system of government, but for different reasons, right? Vince, do you have a question?
I was just looking at myself on the monitor there.
What do you see? You can fix your hair and
I didn't know I was there.
there you are. That's right. But that's what the triage idea is. And Calvin, because of that, Calvin said we can be more loose grip on these things, on the structures of government. Should we have a constitution, constitutional convention, articles of confederation? This is not a matter of whether a person's saved or not. So he changed. That's the point that Pennings makes in his book, is that from the first edition of the Institutes to the last edition, I think we're 3 or 4 changes, Calvin adjusted his views. Right. And so that's how he sets out the question, or this idea. And another one is Reformed Christians Reformed theology has, or Reformed Christians have, a positive view of government, civil authorities holding a commission from God. So that's important, because there are groups, non-Christian and Christian, who think civil authority is bad. Reformed Christians, by and large, and Calvin really wanted to get this across to the King of France, we have a positive view of government. Why would he want that? Why would he want to communicate that to the king, you think?
Because he's the head of the civil government.
That's right. That's right. And there's all sorts of people out there saying, Calvin, he's just an anarchist. He just wants to get rid of authority.
Weren't kings, biblical kings, primarily used as punishments for the nation of Israel, though? Like, wasn't that to have a king was always a punishment, because the king wasn't going to be as just as God was, and typically always had some sort of failure because they're human.
That was the result. I mean, it's interesting too, because I wouldn't say a punishment. I would say God. It was actually in God's design.
Right.
So when Moses received Deuteronomy, for example, there were instructions for the king before they had a king, a few hundred years before they had a king. And so there's this expectation. And actually, I think it says in Deuteronomy, when you ask for a king, this is the kind of king you should be looking for. And then he should have a copy of the law and write it down by hand. Do you remember this? Yeah. You remember this, Deuteronomy 17 maybe, or anything? So there's an expectation that there will be a king.